So we change to the final presentation. Again, we have an operating system change. No problem on that. So I have the honor to introduce Trenton from Norwegian Computer Center. I forgot about the well, you don't see the question yet, but we now will have a very interesting question. Do you trust your toaster? And I think we have already a lot of discussions on trust and security. I think Trenton will guide us through that idea.
Thank you. Yes, so my name is Trenton Schulz. I'm a senior research scientist at the Norwegian Computing Center. Normally I do most of my work in e-inclusion or universal design of ICT, but I do dabble a bit in information security. And today I'm going to be talking to you about trusting our toasters, dealing with real-life issues in the Internet of Things. And most of the work here is going to be based on the uTRUSTit project, which was part of the EU 7th Framework Program. So, when we talk about trusting our toasters here, I'm actually basing this title from an essay that was put in Sun Tzu's Information Warfare from back in 97, actually, that was called Do You Trust Your Toaster? They don't actually talk too much about toasters in that essay, but I want to talk about toasters here because I like toasters. No, but what I'm talking about here is not the idea of do we trust our toasters to actually make good toast, you know, to not set things on fire, or do we trust them to not keep us from doing stupid things? By the way, if you are going to put a fork in a toaster, please unplug it first. A safety tip. What we're talking about here is this idea of surveillance. Possibly your toaster doing some surveillance on you, or possibly your toaster being an accomplice in a robbery or something like that. So what we're talking about here, or what I'm trying to talk about here, is this idea of the Internet of Things. How many people are familiar with the Internet of Things? Okay, quite a few. That's good. So we're basically, just to review, talking about this idea of all these everyday objects sort of communicating with each other and communicating possibly out onto the internet with other entities. And most of these are probably your everyday objects that don't have a normal user interface. So I'll just try to give an example here using some personas that we had from our project. So we're going to use an example of a smart home, which would be a great place to put many Internet of Things objects, you could say. So we have our person here, whose name is Paul, and Paul has started to show some early signs of dementia. But if he follows a schedule, you know, a pretty good schedule for during the day, he'll do okay. And I'm sure that you probably have heard from different countries that a big theme that everybody wants to do is to make sure that people are able to live at home longer and live more independently. So a smart home might be something that could be very helpful for Paul here. And at the same time, we have David, who is Paul's son and wants to be able to follow along and make sure that Paul is doing everything that he says, or what is going on. So he can check in what's going on in the smart home environment. And to keep the toaster analogy strong, we'll pretend that Paul really likes to have toast in the morning, and that this is something that can be sort of a nice indicator to indicate that Paul has gotten up and is actually eating toast, and is actually up and around and not in trouble or have wandered away. So we could say that there's a smart toaster there that sort of looks at what sort of toast has been made, when it was made, you know, and can transmit this information off to David, who can read it for later. But let's kind of think about that for a second. So we're sending out information about like what sort of toast was made or something like that. So this information could actually be transmitted to Paul so that Paul knows what's going on. But at the same time, this information could be transferred to other places as well. Perhaps to a doctor who maybe wants to make sure that Paul is eating okay. But it could maybe also be transferred to your insurance company to make sure that you're eating okay and make sure that it's actually your policy is actually matching the toast-loving lifestyle that you have. Another thing could be that maybe it's transferring this information, but it's also transferring this information unencrypted. And somebody outside the house could actually kind of pick up this traffic information and find out when you're eating toast, or find out that after a few days you actually aren't eating toast. So maybe this is an okay time to come on over and help themselves to the valuables in your house. So the question we have when we're dealing with this, with the Internet of Things, is kind of this idea of, can we trust these different things with our data? And how can we find out about, these different things, since they have usually not a standard interface that we can normally check. They normally have an interface for just doing the everyday things. And this is kind of the question that we were working on in the uTRUSTit project. So I'll just kind of review a bit about what we've done in the uTRUSTit project. One of the things that we worked on in the uTRUSTit project was creating a trust feedback toolkit. Now, the trust feedback toolkit was something that would be built and then installed on, or that developers could use when they were developing their apps or their Internet of Things objects. And what it would do is that it could communicate information, and this could be displayed inside inside of a smartphone or a tablet, so giving you an interface that you might not normally have. I think one thing that I should also mention here that was a big topic while we were working on this project is the idea of what is trust. Because this was also touched on earlier in the morning when we were talking about different research organizations or disciplines, each having their own terminology. And for this project, it was sort of a cross between information security, psychology, usability, ICT, lots of different groups. And we had a long discussion about what we meant by trust when we were working with this thing. By long discussion, I mean many, many months. What we came up with that we all could live with was this idea of using the user's side of trust. And so when we talk about trust in uTRUSTit, we're talking about the user's side, and we're talking about the user's confidence in an entity's reliability, including that user's acceptance of vulnerability in a potentially risky situation. So that's what we're meaning by trust in here. I think the picture illustrates it quite okay in a sense, but we're talking about two users there. Anyway, so we created this trust feedback toolkit, and we needed to make sure that we could actually see how people could use it. And what this required was sort of creating our own virtual Internet of Things environments to show off how this was working. So before we built the actual prototypes, we decided to build a virtual environment, and so I will show a quick video here where we tested these things in a virtual environment, and you can kind of see an example of how this trust feedback toolkit should work. So in this environment here, this person is using a vending machine, using NFC, and this is the trust feedback toolkit trying to give extra information about what's going on in the environment. And so it's saying that, okay, you're buying coffee, it's only 20 Norwegian kroner, and that's a safe buy because it's underneath a certain threshold. And so then you can see that after talking to the trust feedback toolkit, deciding that it's okay, then they actually get the coffee. And then this is a similar situation with a different machine which was doing some perfume, which was over 500 kroner and Norwegian crowns. And this was also kind of giving a warning that, hey, you're about to transfer a fair amount of money, do you actually want to do this? And so they accept that, and then they get the perfume. People have commented on it me before that the prices here are very unrealistic for a Norwegian society, but I'll leave that for another time. So you can see sort of the basic idea of the trust feedback toolkit there, but the interesting thing was there were a lot of icons that were there, and there were a lot of text, and really most people didn't bother reading most of that. So they just kind of clicked through and chose to accept or not. So we tried to do a little bit more work to try to figure out what are better ways of visualizing trust. And so this is a user test that was done where we were showing different ways of presenting this trust information and how it could possibly be presented better to the user, simpler to the user. We had a lot of different metaphors that we were using for this. What we came up with was something that was based on a level system. This of course requires a bit of definition of what should go in each level or where the level should be. But the idea was that we would color code the level and then also show a position of where the level was, so it was fairly easy that you could find out by just looking what needed to be done. And you could also, at this point, if you really wanted to, you could swipe over and get more details, such as the encryption level and things like that. So that's what we did for this next round of user testing. And I have a short video to show an example of this using some real prototypes. So this person is going to be using a medicine cabinet, using RFID on the phone. And actually here what we decided to do was actually put the Trust Feedback Toolkit on the medicine cabinet instead of on the phone instead. But in this case it actually is, you can see here, it's getting a excellent security setting, and then basically then they know that it's okay for them to take medicine. Although here you can say, you can see what quickly there's one thing that, the technology for detecting if you've opened or closed the medicine cabinet is fine, but you can see here, she actually doesn't take her medicine. She just kind of fakes taking medicine. So you need to solve that problem as well. You can't just you can't just look at the state of the medicine cabinet. Anyway, just some quick results that we got from this user test. I'll try to summarize very quickly. So the idea of the TFT was very well received. Most of the users liked this idea that they were actually able to see the security information. And especially for some users, they really kind of got the idea as time went on that there actually was a point in getting this information. And they actually became more aware of the need for the security as they were working with all these different objects in their environment. But one thing that was a bit interesting though was that there was a kind of confusion versus changing the trust settings versus actually reporting the settings. So what the Trust Feedback Toolkit basically does is give how if you can trust or what the trust level is. But some people thought about well, I don't like that it's actually that trust level, I would rather change it. And for them, when they were looking at it on the mobile phone, they saw these as buttons. So they would actually go around and try to press the button and say, I want this to actually be at this security level, not at that security level. And you would have to eventually explain, you can't actually change it, it's just reporting what's there. It's like the equivalent of, if you were thinking about a web browser and you're I'm not an encrypted site, I want to click on that padlock and have the padlock log in and hit an automatic encrypted connection. It just doesn't work. But another point that was brought up by some users was, how can I trust this information that actually comes from the TFT? Because the TFT knows all this information about what this communication is going on, but how did that TFT get that information, and where are they getting that information from? And that was something that we actually were showing in the UI, and there was no way for you to know how you trust, or how the TFT had gotten that information. So that was, the project is near its end, but we have a couple of little things that we hope to take a look at. We might try to update the prototypes, try to make these things not look like buttons, and try to present better information to users. Last year we wrote some guidelines about how you should try to convey this trust information to people. We're updating that for this year, and it should hopefully be there soon, I hope next month. And I'll just try to close on a happy note, or basically, so maybe in the future, thanks to ideas like the TFT, we can have less fires with our privacy and security issues, and maybe more time getting the benefit of using the technology and trusting our toasters. Thank you.